The morning sun peeked through the blinds of her small apartment as she got ready for work. Lisa had been a flight attendant for 15 years now. At 42, her once bright blue uniform had seen better days, but she wore it with the same pride as she had on her very first flight. Today was supposed to be just another day at work. Lisa checked her reflection one last time, adjusting her hair clip and straightening her name tag. The bags under her eyes told the story of too many early mornings and late nights crossing time zones. Still, she managed to smile. Another day, another dollar, she muttered to herself, grabbing her roller bag and heading out the door. The airport was buzzing with activity as Lisa made her way through security. Fellow crew members nodded in greeting as they gathered for the pre-flight briefing. Today's flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles was fully booked. A packed plane on a Friday wasn't anyone's idea of fun, but Lisa was a professional. She'd handled worse. "Heads up, everyone," the captain said during their briefing. "There's some weather in the Midwest that might delay our takeoff. Keep the passengers calm if we get held up." Lisa nodded along with the others. Delay announcements were never well received, especially on a 6-hour flight where many passengers had connecting flights or important meetings waiting for them in there. Sure enough, 2 hours later, Lisa stood at the gate with her most apologetic smile as frustrated passengers filed past her onto the plane. "Welcome aboard." "Sorry about the delay," she repeated over and over like a broken record. Some people nodded politely. Others barely acknowledged her existence. "This is ridiculous," one businessman grumbled, not even looking at her as he passed. "I'm going to miss my connection because of this." "I understand, sir," Lisa replied automatically. "Our ground team will help rebook any missed connections once we land." The boarding process took longer than usual. People struggled with overstuffed carry-ons, trying to avoid the checked bag fees. A young mother juggled a crying baby and a diaper bag. 2 teenagers argued over who would get the window seat. By the time everyone was seated, Lisa's cheeks hurt from forcing her smile. The air conditioning wasn't working properly while they sat on the tarmac, and the cabin grew uncomfortably warm. Complaints multiplied. "Can we get some air back here? How much longer until takeoff? Is there any water available?" Lisa and her colleagues moved through the narrow aisle, distributing cups of water and reassurances in equal measure. When they finally took off, a small cheer went up from a few passengers, quickly followed by sighs of relief as the air conditioning kicked in properly. 3 hours into the flight, Lisa had settled into the familiar rhythm. Drink service, snack service, trash collection, checking on passengers who needed special attention. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and the seatbelt sign dinged on. Lisa steadied herself against a seat back as the plane bounced through a rough patch of air. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign," she announced over the intercom. "Please return to your seats and secure your seatbelts." As the turbulence subsided, Lisa noticed a passenger in the back still standing, rummaging through the overhead bin. She made her way down the aisle. "Sir, I need you to take your seat and fasten your seatbelt," she said firmly but politely. The man nodded and closed the bin, but as he turned to sit down, the plane shook again. He stumbled, bumping into Lisa. She caught herself on the arm of a seat, feeling the beginnings of a headache forming behind her eyes. This flight was turning into one of those days where everything that could go wrong did. Little did Lisa know, the real trouble hadn't even begun. The next few hours would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine as she steadied herself and continued down the aisle, straightening a fallen pillow and checking seatbelts as she went. The airplane hummed steadily as it cut through the clouds. 4 hours into the flight, Lisa's feet were already aching. The delay had thrown off the entire meal service schedule, and passengers were getting hungry and irritable. She'd been on her feet almost non-stop since takeoff, trying to make up for lost time. "Any chance we could get some pretzels back here?" called a voice from row 27. Lisa nodded with a practiced smile and made a mental note to bring snacks on her next pass through the cabin. The passenger in seat 19D caught her attention as she moved down the aisle with the beverage cart. He'd pressed the call button 3 times in the last hour, first for a blanket, then for headphones, and finally to complain that his TV screen wasn't working properly. "Just ignore him," her colleague Jen whispered as they crossed paths in the galley. "He's been giving everyone a hard time." Lisa sighed and continued her rounds. The turbulence had finally settled, but the mood in the cabin remained tense. A businessman glared at her when she accidentally brushed his elbow with the cart. A woman complained that her coffee was too hot. Small irritations multiplied in the confined space of the airplane cabin. Then came the noise. A sharp, angry voice rising above the dull roar of the engines. Lisa turned to see what was happening in the back of the plane. A tall man was standing up, gesturing angrily at the passenger in front of him. "You've had your seat all the way back for 3 hours." The standing man shouted, "I can't even use my tray table." The passenger in front twisted around in his seat. "The seat reclines for a reason," he shot back. "Deal with it." Other passengers were turning to watch now. Some looked annoyed, others concerned, a few even entertained by the break in monotony. Lisa quickened her pace, moving toward the disruption. Arguments like this could escalate quickly in the cramped confines of an airplane. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the two men. "Is there something I can help with?" The standing passenger turned toward her, his face flushed with anger. This guy, he jabbed a finger toward the seat in front of him, has had his seat pushed all the way back since takeoff. "My knees are crushed. I can't eat, I can't work, I can't even stretch my legs." Lisa looked between the two men, trying to assess the situation. The seated passenger rolled his eyes. "It's my right to recline my seat," he insisted. "I paid for this ticket just like everyone else." "Sir," Lisa addressed the standing man, keeping her voice calm and level, "I understand your frustration, but I need you to lower your voice and take your seat. I'll see what I can do to make you more comfortable." "More comfortable?" he repeated, his voice rising again. "There's no way to be comfortable with his seat in my lap." He gestured wildly, his arms sweeping through the air. The passenger across the aisle flinched away from his movements. A child started crying a few rows back, startled by the raised voices. Lisa could feel the situation spiraling out of control. "Sir, please," she said more firmly, "you need to sit down now. You're disturbing the other passengers." He turned toward her, his expression darkening. "So I'm just supposed to sit here in misery for another 2 hours? While this guy—" He swung around to point at the reclining passenger again, his arm moving sharply through the air. Lisa instinctively stepped back, bumping into the beverage cart behind her. The cart rolled backward slightly, causing a plastic cup to topple over, spilling water onto the floor. Other passengers were watching openly now. An older woman clutched her purse to her chest, looking anxious. A flight attendant from first class had noticed the commotion and was making her way down the aisle. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The standing man took a step toward Lisa, still gesturing angrily. "This is unacceptable," he insisted. "I want to speak to the captain or whoever's in charge. Someone needs to fix this situation right now." Lisa stood her ground, even as her heart raced. In 15 years of flying, she'd learned that moments like these were turning points. How she handled the next few seconds would determine whether the situation calmed down or erupted into something much worse. She took a deep breath and prepared to respond, not knowing that her next action would change everything. Time seemed to slow down as the angry passenger stepped closer to Lisa. His voice had gotten louder, and she could see veins standing out on his neck. Other passengers were watching with wide eyes, some holding up phones, ready to record whatever happened next. "I need you to back up and lower your voice," Lisa said firmly, raising her hand in a stop gesture between them. "We can solve this, but not like this." The man shook his head, frustration evident in every movement. "Nobody on this flight is listening. I've been uncomfortable for hours." He turned suddenly, his arms swinging out as he pointed back at the passenger who had reclined his seat. The quick movement startled Lisa. It looked like he might be about to strike someone. Her training kicked in: protect the passengers, prevent violence at all costs. Without thinking, she reacted. Her hand shot up and connected with the side of his face in a sharp slap. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Complete silence fell over the airplane. Even the crying child a few rows back went quiet. Lisa stood frozen, her hand still raised, shock written across her face. The man's head had turned sideways from the impact, his cheek already turning red. Slowly, he turned back to face her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. Lisa's stomach dropped. What had she done? In 15 years as a flight attendant, she had never, not once, laid hands on a passenger. Her training emphasized de-escalation, not confrontation. She had broken the most basic rule of her profession. I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I thought you were going to. Going to what? The man asked, his voice dangerously quiet now. Hit someone. Is that what you thought? Lisa couldn't answer. The reality of what she'd done was sinking in, along with the potential consequences. Job termination, lawsuits, headlines, social media outrage. Her entire career flashed before her eyes. But worse than all of that was the man's expression. The hurt and humiliation in his eyes cut deeper than any punishment the airline might give her. Jen appeared at her side, having pushed her way down the aisle when she heard the commotion. What happened? She whispered urgently. The man touched his cheek, where Lisa's handprint was still visible. This flight attendant just assaulted me, he said, his voice level but intense, in front of everyone. Phones were definitely recording now. Several passengers had stood up to get a better view. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" She just hit him. "Sir, I am so sorry," Lisa said, finding her voice again. "I completely misinterpreted." "Lisa," Jen interrupted, her face pale. "Do you know who this is?" Lisa looked more carefully at the passenger she had just slapped. Something about him did seem familiar, but in her panicked state she couldn't place him. "This is Thomas Reynolds," Jen said quietly. The name hit Lisa like a physical blow. Thomas Reynolds. The same Thomas Reynolds who had been on the cover of Business Week last month. The civil rights attorney who had recently joined the airline's executive board. The man who had spent his career fighting against discrimination in the transportation industry. She had just slapped one of her company's top executives. A renowned civil rights lawyer. A black man who had faced discrimination his entire life. "Mr. Reynolds," she braved, horror washing over her. I had no idea." "Would it have mattered if you did?" he asked quietly. "Would it have mattered if I was anyone else?" The question hung in the air between them. Lisa had no answer. Around them, passengers watched in stunned silence, the entire cabin held in the grip of the unfolding drama. In the background, the plane's engines continued their steady hum, carrying them all toward Los Angeles, and toward whatever consequences awaited when they landed. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Lisa's life. The chief flight attendant, Paula, had pulled her aside into the galley area after witnessing the commotion. "What happened back there?" Paula asked, her voice low and urgent. "Did you actually hit a passenger?" Lisa's hands were shaking as she leaned against the counter. "I thought he was going to strike someone," she whispered. "I reacted without thinking. And now I've just slapped Thomas Reynolds." Paula's face drained of color. "The Thomas Reynolds? Board member Thomas Reynolds." Lisa nodded miserably. "I didn't recognize him until after." Paula rubbed her forehead. "I need to call the captain. You stay here." Left alone in the galley, Lisa tried to steady her breathing. Through the curtain, she could see passengers looking her way, whispering to each other. Someone was surely uploading video of the incident already. By the time they landed, it would probably be all over social media. 15 years of perfect service records, countless grateful passengers, letters of commendation, all wiped away in a single moment of misjudgment. Paula returned, her expression grim. "The captain has informed headquarters. They're sending someone to meet the plane when we land. You're relieved of duties for the remainder of the flight." Lisa nodded, fighting back tears. "What about Mr. Reynolds? Is he okay?" Jen gave him some ice for his cheek. "He's refused further assistance." Paula hesitated. "Look, Lisa, I've known you for 10 years. You're one of our best. But this is serious." "I know," Lisa whispered. "Go sit in the jump seat in the back. Stay out of sight until we land." For the next hour and a half, Lisa sat alone, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The man's gesture, her misinterpretation, the sound of her hand connecting with his face. What if she had paused for just one more second? What if she had stepped back instead of forward? The announcement to prepare for landing jolted her from her thoughts. Soon she would face the consequences of her actions. Would there be police waiting? Reporters? She imagined the headlines. "Flight attendant assaults civil rights leader." As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Lisa felt sick with dread. The familiar routine of landing announcements and passenger preparations washed over her, but she remained seated, separate from it all now. After the passengers had disembarked, Paula appeared. "They want you to come with me. Company representatives are waiting in the terminal." Lisa followed her colleague through the empty airplane. Mr. Reynolds had already left, presumably. She wondered if she would ever have the chance to properly apologize to him. As they walked through the jet bridge, Lisa caught a glimpse of the bright California sunshine through the terminal windows. Such a beautiful day for her career to end. A stern-looking woman in a corporate suit waited at the gate. "Lisa Chen," she asked, checking her tablet. "I'm Victoria from HR. Please come with me." Lisa followed Victoria through the bustling terminal, past travelers rushing to make connections and families reuniting at arrival gates. Such normal, everyday scenes, while her world was collapsing. They arrived at a small conference room near the airline's offices. Victoria opened the door and gestured for Lisa to enter. Sitting at the table inside was Thomas Reynolds. His cheek was slightly swollen, with the faint outline of a handprint still visible. He wore an expensive suit and had reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he reviewed some documents. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Reynolds," Victoria said, "this is Lisa Chen, the flight attendant from today's incident." Thomas nodded. "Yes, we've met," he said dryly, "though under less than ideal circumstances." Lisa stood frozen in the doorway, unsure what to do or say. Was he here to witness her firing? To confront her before filing charges? "Please have a seat, Ms. Chen," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You and I need to have a conversation about what happened today." Lisa slowly moved to the chair and sat down, her legs feeling like they might give way at any moment. This was it. Whatever happened next would determine the course of her future. The conference room felt too small, too warm. Lisa sat with her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the table, Thomas Reynolds studied her with calm, thoughtful eyes. Victoria from HR cleared her throat. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said, stepping out and closing the door behind her. Silence filled the room. Lisa could hear the muffled announcements from the terminal outside, the occasional rumble of a plane taking off. Normal sounds from a world that suddenly felt very far away. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am," Lisa finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I did was completely unprofessional and inexcusable." Thomas nodded slightly but said nothing. "I've never done anything like that before," she continued, words tumbling out now. "In 15 years as a flight attendant, I've dealt with drunk passengers, people having medical emergencies, even one man who tried to open the emergency exit mid-flight. But I've never responded with physical force." She took a shaky breath. "I misinterpreted your movement. I thought you were going to hit someone, but that's not an excuse. I should have handled it differently." Thomas leaned forward slightly, wincing as the movement aggravated his cheek. "Do you know why I was upset on that plane, Ms. Chen?" Lisa shook her head. "I've been traveling for 2 weeks straight. Conference in New York, meetings in Chicago, a case in Atlanta. I'm tired. My back hurts. And yes, I was uncomfortable because the man in front of me had his seat all the way back for 3 hours. He adjusted his glasses, but mostly I was upset because this is the 3rd flight this month where I've been treated differently than other passengers." Lisa frowned, not understanding. "On my flight to New York, I was asked to move from first class because they needed to balance the weight on the aircraft. Funny how the white businessman who boarded after me wasn't asked to move." His tone was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. "On my return from Chicago, a flight attendant followed me to the bathroom twice, asking if I needed anything, while watching me the entire time." Lisa felt a cold weight settling in her stomach. "So when I stood up on today's flight, frustrated about my seat, and suddenly found myself being slapped by a flight attendant," he spread his hands. "It fit a pattern I've experienced my entire life. Mr. Reynolds, I swear to you it wasn't about." He held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say. It wasn't about race. Maybe in your mind it wasn't. But ask yourself this. Would you have slapped a small, elderly white woman who made the same gesture? Or would you have given her the benefit of the doubt?" The question hit Lisa like a physical blow. She wanted to protest, to defend herself, but the words died in her throat. Would she have reacted the same way? She truly didn't know. "I don't think you're a bad person, Ms. Chen," Thomas continued. "In fact, the crew members I spoke with after we landed all said you're one of the best flight attendants they've worked with. They were shocked by what happened." Lisa blinked back tears. "They should be shocked. I shocked myself." Thomas nodded, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "The airline has given me several options regarding how to proceed. I could press charges. I could demand your termination. I could go public with what happened." Lisa's throat tightened. Her entire future hung on what this man decided to do next. "But none of those options actually solves anything," he said, opening the folder. "They might satisfy anger or pride, but they don't address the real issues at play." He slid a document across the table toward her. "That's why I've proposed something different." Lisa looked down at the paper, confusion mixing with the fear and shame that had been her only companions for the past few hours. The document wasn't a termination notice or a lawsuit. The heading read, "Proposed Training Program, De-escalation and Unconscious Bias in Airline Customer Service." She looked up, meeting Thomas's steady gaze, unable to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't at all what she had expected. Lisa stared at the document, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't a termination notice. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was something entirely unexpected. "I don't understand," she said finally, looking up at Thomas. "You want to create a training program?" Thomas nodded, touching his swollen cheek gently. "What happened between us today represents a bigger problem, one that firing you won't solve." He leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "The airline industry has a particular challenge. Flight attendants make split-second decisions in confined spaces with people from all walks of life. It's stressful. Things happen fast. And sometimes our brains take shortcuts." Lisa listened, still not quite believing that she wasn't being fired on the spot. "Those shortcuts, those unconscious biases, they affect everyone," Thomas continued. "Even good people with good intentions. I've spent my career fighting discrimination in transportation, and I've learned that punishment rarely creates lasting change. Education does." "So you want me to take a training course?" Lisa asked hesitantly. Thomas shook his head. "No, I want you to help create one." He slid the document closer to her. Lisa glanced down, reading phrases like first-hand experience and personal testimony and collaborative development. "You have 15 years of experience handling difficult situations on airplanes," Thomas explained. "Today, you handled one badly, but I bet there are hundreds you've handled well. That knowledge is valuable." Lisa shook her head in disbelief. "Mr. Reynolds, I assaulted you. In front of an entire plane full of witnesses. There are probably videos all over the internet by now. Why would you want to work with me?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "When I was 10 years old, my teacher accused me of stealing another student's calculator. I hadn't taken it, but she was convinced I had. Made me empty my backpack, my pockets, even checked my socks, all in front of the entire class." He looked out the window at a plane taxiing on the runway. Later that day, the calculator turned up in the gym. The teacher never apologized, never acknowledged what she'd done. And I learned a powerful lesson that day about how some people would always see me. Lisa felt a lump in her throat. "But," Thomas continued, "what if she had apologized? What if she had acknowledged her mistake and used it as a moment to teach herself and others? Maybe that would have taught me a different lesson." He turned back to her. "I believe people can learn and grow from mistakes, Ms. Chen, even painful ones, maybe especially from painful ones." Victoria from HR knocked softly and re-entered the room. "Mr. Reynolds, the company representatives are ready to meet with you now." Thomas nodded. "Thank you. I'll need a few more minutes with Ms. Chen first." After Victoria left, Thomas handed Lisa a business card. "I haven't made my final decision yet. The airline is presenting options to me tomorrow, but I wanted you to know what I'm considering." Lisa took the card, still stunned by this unexpected turn. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," Thomas replied. "But if you're genuinely interested in turning this incident into something meaningful, call my office tomorrow. My assistant will put you through. He gathered his papers and stood to leave. "One more thing, Ms. Chen. If we do this, it won't be easy. You'll need to talk openly about what happened. You'll face tough questions, maybe even criticism. Aren't you prepared for that?" Lisa thought for a moment. The easy path would be to accept her firing, find another job, try to forget this whole terrible day. But that wouldn't erase what she'd done. It wouldn't change anything. "I think," she said slowly, finding a strength in her voice that surprised her, "that if something good could come from my mistake, it would be worth it, no matter how difficult." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a start. I'll talk to you tomorrow, Ms. Chen." As he left the room, Lisa sat alone, the business card in her hand feeling like a lifeline she never expected to receive. For the first time since the slap, she felt something besides shame and fear. It was small, but unmistakable. A flicker of hope. 3 months later, Lisa stood at the front of a training room filled with flight attendants. Her hands were steady now, though her heart still beat a little faster whenever she told her story. "So there I was," she said to the attentive faces, "with 15 years of experience, thinking I knew exactly how to handle every situation. And in one split second, I made a choice that could have ended my career, and should have." The room was quiet. Some of the newer flight attendants looked uncomfortable, while the veterans watched with knowing eyes. They'd all faced difficult passengers, split-second decisions. "But instead of ending my career," Lisa continued, "that mistake became an opportunity for something better. Not just for me, but hopefully for all of us." She glanced to the side of the room, where Thomas stood watching. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. Over the past 3 months, they had worked together to develop this program. It hadn't been easy. The airline had initially wanted to keep the incident quiet, offering Thomas a significant settlement. But he had been firm. He wanted real change, not just compensation. There had been difficult moments along the way. The first time Lisa had to describe the slapping incident to a room full of airline executives, her voice had shaken so badly she could barely get the words out. The first training session had gone poorly, with some attendees defensive, others skeptical. But they had persisted. Thomas had shared his expertise on unconscious bias and discrimination in the transportation industry. Lisa had contributed her years of experience in conflict management at 30,000 feet. Together, they had created something neither could have managed alone. "The training we're doing today isn't about making you feel guilty," Lisa explained to the room. "It's about giving you tools to make better decisions in high-pressure moments. It's about recognizing the shortcuts our brains sometimes take, shortcuts that can lead us to misinterpret situations based on factors we might not even be aware of." A hand went up in the back row. "But we already have diversity training," said a veteran flight attendant. "How is this different?" Thomas stepped forward to answer. "Traditional diversity training tells you what not to do. This program helps you understand why we do what we do and gives you practical techniques to pause, even for just a second, before reacting." That 1 second, Lisa added, can make all the difference. It did for me. As the training continued, Lisa guided the group through scenarios based on real incidents. They practiced de-escalation techniques, discussed pattern recognition, and shared their own experiences of difficult situations in the air. During the lunch break, Lisa stepped outside for a moment of quiet. 3 months ago, she had been certain her career was over. Now here she was, helping to shape how flight attendants across the airline would handle conflicts. Thomas joined her, 2 coffee cups in hand. He passed one to her. "How do you think it's going?" he asked. Lisa considered the question. "Better than I expected. They're really engaging with the material." "You're good at this," Thomas observed. "You make the concepts relatable." Lisa smiled slightly. "Well, I have a pretty powerful story to share." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. What had begun as one of the worst days of Lisa's life had somehow transformed into something meaningful. The incident hadn't been erased. Nothing could do that, but it had been channeled into something constructive. "You know," Thomas said thoughtfully, "we've focused so much on what flight attendants can learn from this. But there's a bigger story here." Lisa looked at him questioningly. "About how we respond to mistakes," he explained. "Not just avoiding them, because we're all going to make them, but what we do afterward, whether we hide from them or learn from them." Lisa nodded. I almost didn't call you that next day. I almost just accepted getting fired and tried to put it all behind me. I'm glad you called, Thomas said simply. Lisa looked through the window at the room full of flight attendants discussing the morning's lessons with animation. I'm glad too. As they headed back inside to continue the training, Lisa felt a sense of purpose that had been missing before that fateful flight. One impulsive action had changed everything, but not in the way she had feared. Sometimes, she had learned, our worst mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth.